Hello, fellow poets and friends of poetry, writing, and literature, and welcome to 10 Minutes to Improve Your Poetry. My name is Nicholas Korn, and I am the poet of the Wild Sonnets. I have published 7 books in my Wild Sonnet series, and each of these books features 100 poems, and each of these poems is fashioned into a variation of the sonnet form that I created in 2016. I am also a playwright, and my stage comedy, Delirium's Daughters, ran off Broadway in 2015. I want to share in this moderately short video a few principles and techniques that I believe will offer new, struggling, and even established language artists ways to bring their work to the next level and help it to have a greater impact on their audiences and readers. That being said, one of my lifelong mantras is that not everything is for everybody. And while I am sharing statements here that I believe are inherently true, and doing so in the hope that something here will help you, I also entirely understand and accept that some of what I say in this accelerated lesson may not align with the work you want to do and may even be controversial. So I'm going to get started with the distinction between what a poem is and what poetry is. The common understanding is that these are the same and relatively interchangeable, with the word poetry most often being used as a collective term for poems. While it would be entirely impossible for me to erase or negate this culturally assumed connection, I want to propose an alternate but significant understanding of the two terms. From my point of view, the term poem at its foundation refers to a form, a way of managing language so that sentences, utterances, and phrases are structured and strictured into lines, and those lines are stacked into units we call stanzas. The sonnet is a form of the poem, and so is free verse, with its more associative flow in approaching how long the lines will be and how many lines each particular stanza will have. So what then is poetry? My most direct response is that poetry is an effect, a way of using language that surprises the reader with novel and unexpected images, verbal constructions, striking comparisons, and concepts. It is language at the next level. In essence, poetry is the opposite of cliché. Let's take a look at an example. Though I would have stayed with you until the end, you turned out to be a fair weather friend. I thought that you were true and tried, but now I set our love aside. Is this a poem? Yes, of course it is. It's 4 lines which are arranged into a stanza. And there's even a rhyme scheme, which is not a necessity for it being a poem. Something in free verse would have worked just as well. Is it poetry? If poetry as an effect is the opposite of cliché, then we would have to seriously question that, since every one of the lines contains a phrase that everyone uses. It is a poem built of clichés, even though the 3rd line tries to be clever by inverting the cliched phrase of tried and true. The next distinction I want to touch upon is whether a poet is using the poem as a vehicle for a message or as an opportunity to create an experience. Like the experiences in life, the experiences in poetry arrive at realizations. The standard way of expressing it, the cliché, if you will, is that they are life lessons. But since lessons are message-based, I much prefer to understand these as realizations. For me, poetry is a process that leads to discovery, not dissertation. For me, messages are fairly two-dimensional, while experiences are alive and go deep. A third and final distinction for me is being a poet of witness rather than simply a poet of self. Of course, I acknowledge completely that there's no way for the self not to be at the center of our poetry. But does the perimeter end at our own person? To put this briefly, to be a poet of self only will very likely lead to being a poet of messages, and being a poet of messages very often leads the writer to lapse into cliches. The need to get a message across as directly as possible, such as on a first reading or hearing, pushes the creator to move to a more immediate means to get their point across, and that often results in language that is already widely familiar rather than expressive, surprising, unexpected, and new. So let's take a second look at the poem we considered a moment ago. I'm going to read it again. Though I would have stayed with you until the end, you turned out to be a fair-weather friend. I thought that we were true and tried, but now I set our love aside. And let's look at another poem. This one is also about a failed relationship. The days now cloud together like milk poured into bleach, a liquid of curdle and curl that I no longer wish to bring my lips to. As you can see, and as we mentioned earlier, the first poem is filled with cliches, which may be because it is very message-based and primarily self-focused. The second poem is composed of striking images, underpinned with a lightly musical use of language, and it actually creates the experience to which the first poem merely alludes. I want to note that even though the first poem is constructed with the use of end rhyme, there is very little to no poetry in it, while the second free verse selection is a better example of how poetry might be produced in a poem. So where can a writer go to get a better understanding of how to produce poetry in their poems? The best starting point I know is a book which has been my own personal, technical Bible for nearly 40 years. And yes, I am that old. The book I'm speaking of is Shakespeare's Use of the Arts of Language by Sister Miriam Joseph. I'm going to refer to Google Books entry for the description of what this amazing work of scholarship has to offer anyone interested in poetry. It reads as follows. Grammar school students in Shakespeare's time were taught to recognize the 200 figures of speech that Renaissance scholars had derived from Latin and Greek sources. This knowledge was one element in their thorough grounding in the liberal arts of logic, grammar, and rhetoric, known as the trivium. The author then lays out those figures of speech in simple, understandable patterns and explains each one with examples from Shakespeare. Now, while this entire book is a fascinating and encyclopedic presentation of this material, the actual handbook of literary devices with examples can be found in the second chapter from pages 43 to 89. Still, this volume is worth reading from cover to cover. And that, as I mentioned, is an extraordinary place to start in expanding your access to principles and techniques that help to shift your writing to embrace and embody poetry as an effect and to move beyond the reflex of writing cliches. And as a next to final note, that's still not the final note. I have made a fairly cogent, though possibly controversial, argument here. But how does my own writing stack up to the standards I put forward? I have to let my poems speak for themselves, and you will find my readings of over 60 wild sonnets here on this YouTube channel. I have been adding to this sequence for over 8 years, and while there have been shifts in tone and focus, the principles I espouse in this video have guided me through 7 books and are still engaged as I work now on the 8th volume. And my final note is this. Thank you for watching. As I said at the very start, not everything is for everybody, but if there are any thoughts or recommendations here that you think will help you reach the next level in your writing, I will be the one who is glad you spent this time with me. Again, I am Nicholas Korn, the poet of the Wild Sonnets. Best wishes to you, and write on.